What if a simple walk home turned into a fight for justice? When a young black woman is wrongfully stopped by a racist police officer, she uncovers a hidden truth that could shake her entire world. Will she stand silent, or will her voice spark a revolution? Watch the truth unfold. This is just the beginning. Where will you be when the fight for justice begins? Maya Thompson walked home from school, her pace slow but deliberate, the rhythmic sound of her footsteps filling the air as she passed through Greenfield's quiet streets. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, but a subtle tension hung in the air, an unease she couldn't quite shake. She wasn't sure why it had crept in today, of all days. Maybe it was the way people had been staring at her, like she didn't belong in this part of town. Or maybe it was the constant, gnawing feeling that she had to be more than just a teenage girl in a world that only seemed to see her as the color of her skin. She adjusted her backpack, her thoughts wandering back to her mother, Mayor Claire Thompson. The pride she felt for her mother's work was always tempered by the weight of expectations. She was always reminded that she wasn't just Maya Thompson, the girl who loved to read and draw. She was the mayor's daughter, and that came with a different kind of gaze, a different kind of scrutiny. As she rounded the corner, she saw the squad car parked on the side of the road. Officer Clark. He was sitting in the car, his eyes scanning the street, though it didn't take long for his gaze to settle on her. He hadn't even said anything yet, but Maya's gut twisted with instinct. She knew what was coming. Her heart beat a little faster as she tried to walk past without making eye contact, but the officer was already stepping out of his vehicle. Maya's mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had done nothing wrong. "Hey, you!" Officer Clark's voice was loud, commanding. Maya stopped, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to face him, trying to keep her posture relaxed, trying not to show the fear creeping up her spine. "Is there a reason you're walking through this area?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. She glanced around, then back at him, bewildered. "I'm just walking home." His gaze didn't soften. "From where?" "From school." Maya's voice was steady, but she could feel the tension building. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was already guilty of something. "Uh-huh," he said, taking a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. "You don't look like you're from around here." Maya felt her pulse quicken. She had seen this before. This kind of questioning, this kind of suspicion, always pointed in her direction. Why was he singling her out? "I'm fine. I'm just heading home," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. The officer's gaze flickered to her backpack, then back at her. "You got ID on you?" His tone had shifted, sharp, demanding. "No, I don't. I'm not doing anything wrong," Maya replied, the knot in her stomach tightening. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't about to show him her ID without cause. "Step over here," Officer Clark ordered, his tone now more commanding. Maya stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Should she just walk away? Would that make things worse? She felt trapped, like there was nowhere to turn. She had been taught to be respectful, to stay calm in situations like this, but the unfairness of it all was like a wave crashing over her. "Are you detaining me, officer?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "Stay calm, Maya. Stay calm." "Move!" the officer snapped. He was getting impatient now, his hand twitching near his radio. He was ready to escalate, and Maya could feel it. Her heart pounded. She wanted to say something, wanted to shout, but she knew better. If she said anything that sounded like resistance, it would make everything worse. All she could do was stay silent and pray this would end quickly. "Why are you stopping me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you don't belong here," Officer Clark said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. The weight of his judgment, the finality in his words, hit Maya hard. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about the years of tension she had felt, of knowing that to some people she would never be seen as just a person. To some people, she would always be an outsider. Maya tried to breathe, to steady her hands, but nothing felt right. It felt wrong. It always felt wrong. She had seen the way people treated her, seen the way the world bent around her mother's power, but still, this was different. This was personal. "I don't think you have a right to stop me," Maya said, her voice steady now, but she could feel her body trembling slightly under the pressure. She didn't want to back down. She couldn't back down. The officer took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Let me see your bag." "No," Maya said firmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't have to show you anything." A moment of silence stretched between them, and for the briefest second, Maya thought he might let her go. But instead he stepped forward, his hand reaching for her bag. Maya stood still, her pulse hammering in her chest, her breath shallow. Officer Clark's presence loomed over her like a shadow, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't backing down. His eyes never left her as he moved closer, stepping toward her in deliberate, measured strides. Maya's mind raced, her heart thudding painfully in her ears. She wanted to shout at him, to demand he explain why he was treating her this way, but something inside her told her to stay quiet, to hold her ground. "You're really going to make me do this?" Clark's voice was cold, calculated. His hand hovered near his gun belt as he eyed her suspiciously. "This is your last chance. I'll ask you one more time. Are you going to show me what's in your bag?" The question hung in the air, a challenge, a threat. Maya's eyes darted to the crowd that had gathered, their eyes fixed on her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. She could feel their gaze, but she kept her focus on Officer Clark. Why was he doing this? Why her? "No," Maya finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was strength in it. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Clark's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck flexing. He took another step closer, his body towering over her. "Listen, kid, I don't have time for this. You're making it harder on yourself. Just show me the bag, and I'll let you go." Maya shook her head. She could feel her hands beginning to tremble, but she balled them into fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay steady. She wasn't going to let him bully her into submission. She hadn't done anything wrong. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said. Her voice gaining strength, but the words sounded hollow even to her ears. The truth of it echoed in her mind, and yet she knew, deep down, that it didn't matter. To him, to this system, she was already guilty. Her silence, her hesitation, was an accusation in his eyes. It wasn't about what she had done, it was about who she was. Clark's lips curled into a sneer. "You're making a mistake, girl," he growled. "This is your last chance. I'm not asking again." The words hit her like a slap, and Maya's stomach twisted. She had heard it all before, the whispered threats, the disdain in their voices. But this time, something felt different. This time, it was personal. Clark stepped forward again, his hand moving to her bag. Maya flinched, the movement instinctual, her body bracing for whatever came next. But then, something inside her snapped. "No!" she shouted, stepping back quickly, her voice stronger now. "You don't get to do this! You don't get to treat me like this for no reason!" The officer froze, his hand still hovering over her bag. The air between them crackled with tension, a palpable force that seemed to slow everything down. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but her words spilled out before she could stop them. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said again, louder this time, as if speaking the truth might make it real. "I'm just walking home. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just—" The officer cut her off with a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Don't talk back to me," he snapped, his voice hard like steel against her skin. "You don't get to make the rules. You don't get to decide what's right and wrong here." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Why did he think he had this right? Why did he think he could just stop her, question her, without any reason at all? It wasn't just about her now. This was bigger. This was the system she had been told to trust, the authority that was supposed to protect her, now turning against her. The crowd murmured, some shifting nervously, others staring at the scene unfolding before them. Maya could feel their eyes on her, some with sympathy, others with judgment, but none of them were stepping in. Why wasn't anyone saying anything? Why wasn't anyone helping her? "I'm not going to let you do this," Maya said, her voice quieter now, but firm. She wasn't going to be quiet anymore. She wasn't going to let them continue pretending that this was okay. "You don't have the right to stop me. You don't have the right to touch me." Clark's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something darker crossing his features. His hand hovered near his radio, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. For a split second, Maya thought he might just walk away, that the moment of tension would pass and things would go back to normal. But then, a flash of movement caught her attention. A phone raised high in the crowd. Emily, her best friend, was recording. Maya's heart dropped. The knowledge that Emily was capturing the scene felt both like a relief and a curse. What would happen now? What would this look like when it hit social media? Would it just be another video, another incident lost in the flood of injustice that filled the news every day? Or would it be the one thing that finally made people listen? But Clark didn't back down. Instead, he turned toward Emily, his voice harsh. "Put that phone down." Emily didn't flinch. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." The officer's face flushed red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not in public, not in front of people who were starting to question him. He took a step toward Emily, but Maya rushed in front of her friend, her body shaking with adrenaline. "Stop," Maya said, her voice trembling but strong. "Just stop!" For a moment, the officer stood there, glaring at Maya as if he could intimidate her into submission. But Maya stood tall, her chest rising and falling with every breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't just standing up for herself now. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated this way. She wasn't going to be silent anymore. Officer Clark seemed to realize the power of the moment, the pressure building with every second that passed. His anger shifted into something darker, more dangerous, as he reached for his radio. "Let's see how far this goes," he muttered under his breath. And in that moment, Maya knew the fight was far from over. The tension between Officer Clark and Maya escalated quickly. Maya could feel every nerve in her body on high alert as she watched the officer's anger grow. His eyes darted between her and Emily, who was still standing behind Maya, phone in hand, unwavering. Maya's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel her breath catching in her throat, the weight of the situation crushing down on her. This wasn't just a random encounter anymore. It wasn't just about being stopped by a cop. It was something more sinister, something that ran deeper, beyond just this moment. She was beginning to understand how easily things could escalate, how quickly a simple walk home could turn into something else entirely. She watched Clark's hand twitch toward his belt, his fingers curling around the radio clipped there. Maya's thoughts were spinning, trying to think of a way to de-escalate, to get through this unscathed. What would happen if things went further? Would he arrest her for nothing? Would he hurt someone? Would they have to face even more fallout for this single encounter? And then, in the midst of the charged silence, a voice cut through the air. "Hey!" Maya snapped her head toward the sound, blinking in confusion. She hadn't heard anyone speak up, but as she looked around, she saw a woman striding toward them, her expression stern and focused. The woman had a presence that commanded attention. She was tall, with short, curly hair and a confident stride. The crowd parted slightly as she made her way through, her eyes locked on Officer Clark. Maya felt a wave of relief rush over her. Who was this? Was she here to help? "What's going on here?" the woman demanded, her voice calm but firm. Officer Clark straightened, his face stiffening as he turned to face the new arrival. His hand, which had been resting on his radio, fell to his side. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped. But the woman wasn't deterred. She stepped closer, looking directly at Clark, ignoring his dismissive tone. "It does concern me, actually. I've been watching, and I don't like what I'm seeing. Are you really going to keep harassing this girl?" Maya's breath caught. She didn't know this woman, but the fact that someone was speaking up felt like a lifeline. Clark looked taken aback by the confrontation. For a brief moment, Maya thought he might back down, but instead, his eyes hardened. "She's not cooperating," he snapped. "I'm just doing my job." The woman's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not talking about you doing your job. I'm talking about what you're doing to her. She's done nothing wrong." Maya could hardly believe it. Was she really standing there, hearing someone call out the officer like this? She glanced over at Emily, whose eyes were wide in disbelief. Maya felt the tension in her chest loosen a little, but the situation wasn't over. She still didn't know where it would lead. The officer hadn't backed off yet. The threat was still very real. "Maybe you should be the one to step aside," Officer Clark growled, his voice rising with frustration. He was losing control, and it was obvious. Maya could hear the edge in his tone now, the subtle aggression. He was upset that someone had dared to challenge him. The woman stood her ground, not even flinching. She was clearly unfazed by Clark's intimidation. "I don't think that's going to happen," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're overstepping, and I'm not going to let you hurt this girl." Maya's mind raced. Could this woman be an ally? She felt a small seed of hope grow, even though it was too soon to know for sure. Clark was silent for a moment, staring at the woman, weighing his options. Maya could see the internal battle playing out on his face. He didn't want to appear weak in front of the crowd, but this woman wasn't backing down. Finally, he grunted in frustration, turning his back to them and heading back to his squad car. "You're lucky," he muttered under his breath, his tone thick with resentment. "I don't have time for this." Maya exhaled slowly, feeling a small wave of relief wash over her. She had expected this to escalate even further. But instead, the officer retreated, his frustration palpable. Maya wasn't sure if she should feel safe or uneasy. There was still a chance he could return, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. The woman turned to Maya and Emily, her face softening. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentler now. Maya nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. "Yeah," she managed to say, her throat tight. "Thanks for stepping in." The woman smiled. "No problem. I've seen too much of this to stay quiet." She looked at Emily, then back at Maya. "I'm glad you're all right." "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice full of curiosity. "I'm just someone who's had enough," the woman replied. "I don't like seeing things like this. You shouldn't have been stopped in the first place, but I'm glad someone was there to stand up for you." Maya didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to hug the woman for intervening, but she held back. The entire scene felt surreal. She was still standing there, trying to process everything that had just happened. She had never felt so vulnerable, and yet, in a way, she felt stronger now, more aware of the power that could be found in speaking up. Officer Clark had left, but Maya knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced an encounter like this. The woman's words stayed with her as she walked away, her eyes scanning the street once more, alert to the possibility that something could go wrong again. But for now, she was safe, and someone had stood up for her. The sound of Maya's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her legs were trembling, and she felt the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. The air seemed to thicken around her, suffocating her, but she forced herself to breathe. The officer had just walked away, retreating into his car like he had done nothing wrong, but this wasn't over. Maya's chest tightened as she stood in the middle of the street, still reeling from the confrontation. She hadn't expected it to go this far. She hadn't expected it to feel so personal. She had tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. She was shaking now, her hands clenched at her sides. What if he came back? What if this wasn't the end? Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up, slow, deliberate. Maya's eyes flicked up instinctively, and there, just a few feet away, was her mother's car, stopping with a slight screech of the brakes. Mayor Claire Thompson. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She watched as her mother stepped out of the car, the familiar aura of authority surrounding her. Mayor Thompson was a woman who had earned her place in a world that had never been kind to her, and she wore that strength like armor. But as she looked toward Maya, Maya could see the strain in her eyes, the same worry she had seen in her mother's gaze so many times before, when politics had crossed the line into personal. "Maya!" Her mother's voice cut through the tension in the air, but there was a hint of panic behind the words. She rushed toward Maya, her eyes scanning the scene quickly, the crowd, the officer walking away. Maya didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just stood there, feeling the weight of it all. Her mother had always been the one to handle situations like this. She had always been the one with the answers. But right now, Maya was the one being questioned, being singled out. Claire stopped in front of her, her expression hardening as she took in the situation. Maya could see her mother's pulse quickening, the muscles in her jaw tightening. Maya knew her mother was trying to stay composed, to keep her political facade intact, but this was different. This was her daughter. I'm fine, Mom," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want her mother to feel like she was the one who had to fix this. Maya could handle it. She had to. But Claire wasn't buying it. She reached out, her hands gently holding Maya's arms, her grip firm, like she was anchoring herself. "Maya, what happened? Why did he stop you?" Maya opened her mouth to explain, but the words didn't come out. The whole situation felt like it had happened to someone else, like it was a bad dream. She had never thought something like this could happen to her. Not like this. He just stopped me, Mom," Maya finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't do anything wrong. He just picked me out like I was some kind of criminal." Claire's eyes darkened. Maya could see the anger flash across her face, the way her mother's shoulders stiffened, like she was preparing for a fight. "Let me handle this," Claire said, her tone sharp. No longer the mother trying to comfort her daughter, but the mayor, the leader who had the power to make things right. She turned toward the officer, her body tense, her eyes locked on him with a fury that Maya had rarely seen. Officer Clark, now seated in his car, had seen Claire approach. For a moment, Maya thought he might get back out, but he didn't. He just sat there, watching, his hand hovering near the car door, unsure of what to do next. Claire marched up to the officer's car, her voice steady but carrying a force that made Maya's stomach tighten. "Officer," she said, her words cutting through the air, "I need to know why you've detained my daughter." Clark didn't respond at first, his eyes flicking between Maya and the mayor. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke, his voice defensive, almost dismissive. "She was acting suspicious," he muttered, his eyes avoiding Claire's. "I asked for her ID and she refused." "Suspicious?" Claire's voice dropped, an edge to it now. "You stopped her for being in a neighborhood she lives in? For walking home from school?" Clark shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "She was in an area she shouldn't have been, that's all." Maya could feel the heat rising in her chest. Shouldn't have been. She was home. She was in her own town, her own neighborhood. The officer was blaming her for something she hadn't done, accusing her of something that wasn't even real. Claire's face hardened, the political leader in her taking over. "You've crossed a line here, officer. I want your badge number now. You will not get away with this. Her eyes narrowed as she held his gaze. For a moment, Clark hesitated, clearly thrown off by the mayor's commanding presence. But then, he reluctantly reached for his badge, pulling it out and showing it to Claire without a word. Maya stood off to the side, watching her mother. She had never seen her this ruthless before, this direct. She had always known her mother was strong, but now, in this moment, Maya felt a sense of awe and fear for what would come next. Claire turned to Maya, her face softening just for a second before she spoke. We're going to handle this. Don't worry. It's going to be okay. But Maya wasn't so sure. She didn't know if this was going to be okay. She didn't know how deep this would go. She only knew that this moment, the feeling of being singled out, of being accused, would stay with her forever. And she didn't know if her mother's words could make it go away. Claire was speaking with Clark again, this time with a few more officers who had arrived on the scene. Maya stood there, feeling like an outsider in her own life, watching as her mother took control of the situation. She was the mayor, the one with the power to make things right. But Maya? She wasn't sure she had any power at all. The drive home was silent. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her fingers gripping the seatbelt tightly, feeling the familiar tension that had settled in the pit of her stomach. Her mother, Claire, kept her eyes on the road, her jaw clenched, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Maya's mind was still racing from the encounter, the officer's accusations still echoing in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling of being targeted, of being accused for something as simple as walking home. But it wasn't just the officer she was trying to make sense of. It was the look in her mother's eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something hidden. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice low but steady. Maya, we need to talk about what happened. Maya swallowed hard. I don't even know what happened, Mom, she whispered. He just stopped me for no reason. He said I was suspicious, but he never gave me a reason. He made me feel like I was a criminal, like I didn't belong. Her voice cracked, the words spilling out in a rush. She wasn't sure why she was so shaken now, why she was breaking down when she had always prided herself on staying strong. Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened. It's not just that, She stopped herself, her voice trailing off. Maya looked at her mother, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? What's going on? Claire's eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror before focusing back on the road. I've been hearing things, Maya, things I didn't want to believe. Maya's heart skipped. What kind of things? Her mother's voice softened, but there was a harsh edge to it. The officer, Clark, he's been involved in other incidents that were covered up. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to bring this kind of attention to you, but I can't ignore it anymore. Maya's stomach twisted. What kind of incidents? What do you mean? Claire sighed, her hands loosening from the wheel slightly as she took a breath. Clark has a history of racial profiling, not just against you but against others. The department has swept things under the rug before. I didn't want you to know this. I didn't want you to think this was personal. She paused, the weight of her words settling between them. But now, I don't know what to do. This isn't the first time he's been involved in something like this, and I've been hearing about it for months. Maya's mind spun. It didn't seem real. The idea that the officer who had treated her this way had done the same to others before. It felt like a sickening betrayal. She had always trusted her mother's judgment, had always believed that the people in charge were there to protect her. But now, everything felt tainted. Why didn't you tell me? Maya's voice was shaky, but the hurt was unmistakable. Why didn't you warn me? Claire's eyes flickered with a mix of guilt and frustration. I didn't want you to have to carry this weight, Maya. You've always been so strong. I didn't want to ruin that for you. But it's not just about you anymore. The system is broken. It's always been broken, and I've been fighting it in my own way, trying to make sure people like you don't have to deal with this. But this is different. Maya swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to break down in front of her mother, but it was hard. It was hard to wrap her mind around everything that was happening. Her mother had always been the pillar of strength for their family, the one who faced battles head-on. Maya had always admired her for that. But now, she saw the cracks beneath that strength, the cracks that were slowly widening. Mom, why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you do something sooner? Maya asked, her voice small. Why did it take him stopping me like that to make you do something? Claire's expression faltered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. I've tried, Maya. I've tried to make a difference from the inside, to fix things quietly, without causing a scene. I thought if I did enough, if I changed enough policies, people wouldn't have to go through what you just went through. But that's not enough anymore. Maya stared at her mother, seeing her in a new light. It wasn't just the system that was broken. It was everything. The very foundation she had believed in, the idea that the law was there to protect them, had been shattered before her eyes. Everything had been a lie. The car fell into another heavy silence. Maya's mind raced, thoughts swirling like a storm. The weight of what her mother had just revealed felt like a ton of bricks on her chest. It wasn't just about one bad cop. The whole system had failed them. Her mother had been trying to fight this invisible battle for years, quietly carrying the burden of knowing the truth while keeping up the image of someone who could change it. But now, it was real. It was right in front of them. And it wasn't just going to go away. Maya, I'm sorry. Claire's voice broke through her thoughts. I should have told you sooner. But now, we need to do something about this. I can't let this go on anymore. Not when it's affecting you. Maya looked at her mother, a fire igniting in her chest. The anger, the frustration, the hurt, it was all there, bubbling to the surface. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen anymore. Her mother had been fighting for change, and now it was her turn. She wasn't going to stay silent. I don't care who we have to go up against, Mom, Maya said, her voice steady and determined. I won't let them treat people like this anymore. Not me, not anyone. Claire looked over at her daughter, her eyes softening with pride. I'm proud of you, Maya. This fight, it's yours now too. Maya nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. It was time to take a stand. The next few days after the incident passed in a blur of news reports, social media outrage, and public scrutiny. Maya had always known her mother's work as mayor put her in the public eye, but nothing had prepared her for what it was like to be in the center of a firestorm. The video of the altercation between Maya and Officer Clark, posted by Emily, had gone viral. Within hours, it spread across news outlets, social media feeds, and protest groups. It wasn't just another story. It was the story. People from all over the country were commenting, sharing, and joining the conversation about racial profiling, police violence, and the systemic injustices faced by Black people every day. Maya sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the phone in her hands, unable to tear her eyes away from the flood of notifications. Some were messages of support, others full of hatred. A few trolls had even targeted her directly, sending venomous comments about her mother's leadership, calling them both names that made Maya's stomach churn. I don't want to see it anymore, Maya whispered to herself. Her fingers hovered over the screen, aching to shut everything down, to pretend none of it was happening. But there was no escaping it. The pressure from the outside world had intensified, and her own world felt like it was collapsing. The phone rang in her hands, snapping her out of the stupor. She looked at the screen, her mother. Taking a deep breath, Maya answered. Hey, Mom. Maya, I just got off a call with the chief of police. Claire's voice came through the receiver, tight and stressed. I'm heading to the office, but we need to talk about this. It's escalating. Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She could hear the exhaustion in her mother's voice, the familiar edge of frustration that had been there before when the pressure of leadership was too much to bear. I know, Maya replied quietly. I see it everywhere. It's overwhelming. Claire's voice softened. I know, sweetheart, but this is bigger than us now. We can't let it slip away. We have to take a stand. Maya's heart tightened. What's happening at the office? What are they saying? Her mother paused. Maya could hear the controlled breaths Claire was taking on the other end of the line. The pressure's building, but the department's trying to downplay it. I've been in meetings all morning trying to get them to take action, but they're hesitating. They're trying to protect their own. Maya felt the blood rush to her face. They're protecting Clark, aren't they? Exactly, Claire said, the anger in her voice now unmistakable. But I won't let them cover this up. I'm putting everything on the table. I've already contacted the media, and we're pushing for a full investigation. We can't let Clark... She broke off, her words trailing into a heavy silence. Maya looked down at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap. Everything was spinning out of control. She had hoped for something simpler, a moment of calm, just to breathe, but now there was no avoiding the storm. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the ugliness beneath the surface, even if it meant tearing down the system that was supposed to protect people like her. I'll be fine, Mom, Maya said quietly, trying to reassure her mother, but the words didn't feel convincing. We'll get through this. Maya. Her mother's voice softened, but there was a finality in it. You're not alone in this, but you need to be ready. The firestorm has already started. This won't be easy. Maya swallowed hard. I know, I'll be ready. After the call ended, Maya sat in the silence of the room. Her fingers hovered over her phone once more, but this time she wasn't sure what to do. The support from the community was undeniable, but the backlash was just as loud. She wasn't just dealing with the anger of the officers involved. This was personal, political, and deeply rooted in the power dynamics of the entire city. She was about to face an army, and she didn't know if she was prepared. The next morning, the phone call came, this time from the media. The reporter wanted an interview with Maya. The requests were starting to pile up now, each one more urgent than the last. Maya had become the face of the movement, her story plastered across every news outlet, every social media account. People were demanding change, and suddenly, Maya had a platform she hadn't asked for. She wasn't sure what to say or how to say it, but the pressure to speak up, to represent something larger than herself, weighed heavily. When her mother got home that evening, the mood was darker than usual. Claire's office had been buzzing all day, calls from both supportive and opposing forces flooding in. The phone rang constantly in the background, but Claire had no time to answer them. The only thing that mattered was the investigation that had started against Officer Clark. "I've been meeting with the police chief and the union representatives," Claire said as she sat down at the kitchen table. Her face was drawn, eyes tired. "They're trying to hold back the evidence, and they're dragging their feet on releasing information, but the people are demanding answers. We're not going to stop until we get them." Maya nodded, a strange calm coming over her. She had never seen her mother like this, driven, determined, but also weary, as if the weight of the city was on her shoulders. This fight wasn't just about police accountability. It was about the very fabric of their community, and whether it would break or heal. "Do you think it will work?" Maya asked, her voice small as if testing the waters of hope. Claire met her gaze, her eyes unwavering. "It has to work, Maya. It's our only chance. We're going to keep pushing until we get the truth. The whole truth." Maya sat back, letting her mother's words sink in. She didn't know if everything would change, but one thing was certain. The firestorm wasn't going to stop until they had answers. And no matter what happened, Maya knew she was part of it now. The tension was rising. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. This was a fight for justice. Maya didn't sleep much that night. The weight of everything she had seen, heard, and felt, kept her wide awake, her mind spiraling through memories of the confrontation with Officer Clark and the whirlwind that had followed. She kept seeing the look on her mother's face when she had spoken about Clark's history, the truth that had been buried for so long now coming to light. The anger was still there, but it was buried under something deeper now. A sense of betrayal, a gnawing realization that the system, the people they trusted, had failed them time and time again. The more she thought about it, the more she realized her mother had been fighting a battle no one could see, a battle to protect people like her. And yet, despite her efforts, it was clear that things weren't changing. That morning, after a restless night, Maya finally dragged herself out of bed and sat at the kitchen table. Her mother had been gone for most of the night, meetings, calls, press conferences. Claire had barely been home these past few days, and Maya felt the distance growing between them. The fight for justice was starting to tear at the very fabric of their lives, and Maya didn't know if it was going to pull them apart or bring them closer. Just as she was about to grab her phone, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was quick, sharp, almost urgent. Maya wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound made her heart jump. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there with a look of quiet desperation on his face was James Thompson, her father. Maya hadn't seen her dad in weeks, not since the tension between him and her mother had begun to rise with everything happening in the city. He had always been the quieter one, the one who didn't get involved in the public side of things, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But now something was different. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by a sense of urgency, his eyes tired, filled with an emotion Maya couldn't place. "Maya, we need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Dad? What's going on?" Maya asked, the tension building in her chest. Her father wasn't one to speak out of turn. This wasn't normal. He stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one saw him. He shut the door softly behind him, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. I don't know how to say this, but I think someone's been feeding information to the wrong people, about your mom, about the investigation into Clark." Maya's stomach dropped. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" James took a deep breath, his face pale. "There's a leak. A very close ally of your mother's has been talking to the police department, giving them details about the investigation, feeding them information on your mom's next moves. I don't know who, but I've seen the signs." Maya felt her knees go weak. "Who?" she whispered, the fear settling in like a heavy weight. "Who would do that?" James's eyes darkened. "Someone we trust. Someone your mom trusts. And they've been doing it for months. Maya shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. No, that can't be true. Not anyone in our circle. I wish it weren't true, Maya, but I've seen it. I've heard it. There are people who want to protect Clark, protect the department, and they'll do whatever it takes, even if it means betraying your mom and this entire family. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She was beginning to piece it all together. The calls her mother had been getting, the sudden pushback from the department, the way things were moving too slowly when they should have been moving fast. It wasn't just the police department that was the problem. There was a deeper level to this, a betrayal hiding in plain sight. Her father's face was pale now, the weight of the situation sinking in. I don't know who it is yet, but I'm trying to find out. I didn't want to tell you, but I can't keep this from you anymore. I know how much you care about your mom's work, and I need you to be prepared for what's coming. Maya felt sick. Her family was being torn apart from the inside out. Why didn't you tell her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell Mom? I couldn't. She's already carrying too much. The last thing I want is to put more on her shoulders. She's already dealing with so much. But she deserves to know, Maya replied, her voice trembling with anger. We deserve to know. This is everything. If someone in our own circle is doing this, I'm going to fix it, I promise. I just needed to tell you first. I didn't want to make it worse. The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. The thought of someone betraying her mother like this, someone close enough to know their every move, made her blood boil. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a battle against the very people who should have been fighting alongside them. Maya couldn't stop the anger from flooding her body. She wanted to scream, to yell at her father for not telling her sooner, but instead, she clenched her fists at her sides. We have to tell Mom. We can't let this go on. We have to find out who did this. Her father's eyes softened, but there was a sadness in them that Maya couldn't ignore. I will, but for now we need to be careful. If the wrong person finds out what we know, it'll only make things worse. Maya took a deep breath, nodding. The betrayal felt like a wound, fresh and painful. And just like that, everything had changed. They weren't just fighting the system anymore. They were fighting the people closest to them. As her father left the house, Maya stood in the doorway, her mind spinning. The fight ahead of them was bigger than she had ever imagined. She didn't just want justice for herself anymore. She wanted the truth, and she was going to get it, no matter what it took. The day had begun like any other. Maya sat in the kitchen, her head spinning with the weight of everything that had happened in the past week. It was all happening so fast, so out of control. The media, the protests, the constant calls for justice, it was too much. But nothing had prepared her for the latest revelation. The phone call came just after breakfast, and Maya knew before she even picked it up that it wasn't good news. The voice on the other end was familiar but somber. Her mother, Claire. There was a heaviness in her tone that Maya hadn't heard before. Maya, we need to talk, Claire said, her voice strained, the exhaustion barely masked. Maya's heart skipped. What's wrong? I'm going to need you to come to the office. There's something you need to know, Claire replied, her words slow, measured, like she was bracing herself for something. It's about your father. Maya felt her stomach twist. Her father hadn't been around much lately. Between the tension at home and the rising pressure on Claire's administration, he had withdrawn, keeping his distance. But Maya hadn't expected anything like this. Is he okay? Maya asked, her voice tight. He's fine, Claire said, but there was something about the way she said it that didn't reassure Maya at all. But this is bigger than just him. It's about what he's been trying to protect you from. What do you mean? Maya asked, her heart pounding. What was happening? Maya, I need you to hear this from me first, before you find out from anyone else. There was a long pause before her mother spoke again, her voice heavy with regret. Your father has been keeping something from us. From me. From you. Maya felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. What is it, Mom? Please, just tell me. It's about the investigation, Claire continued, her voice quivering. I've been looking into Officer Clark and the police department, trying to make sure we do this the right way, but there's something you don't know. Something I didn't know. Maya's mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but it didn't make sense. What was her mother talking about? Maya, your father wasn't just trying to protect you from the public backlash, from the pressure. He's been hiding something much bigger, something tied to the police department. Claire's words hung in the air, the silence suffocating. Maya couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She felt her legs give out beneath her as she sank down onto the kitchen chair. What is it? What is this about? She finally managed to whisper. Claire sighed, her voice breaking. Your father knew about the corruption in the department. He knew about Clark's history, and he didn't tell me. He was trying to protect me, to protect you. He thought if he kept it quiet, it wouldn't explode. But it has, Maya. And now everything is coming out. The connections, the cover-ups. Your father's been complicit in this. Maya's heart felt like it had stopped. The betrayal hit her hard, cutting deeper than anything she had imagined. Her father had known. He had known all along, and he hadn't told her. He had kept this from her, from the people who needed to know the truth. Claire's voice faltered. He thought he could control it. He thought if he played along, kept the peace, things would settle. But it's too late for that now. It's all unraveling. Maya's mind was spinning, trying to process the weight of what her mother had just said. Her father had been hiding the truth, trying to shield them from something he couldn't control. But in doing so, he had trapped them in a web of lies and deception. Why didn't he tell me? Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Why didn't he trust me with the truth? Maya, he thought he was protecting you. He thought if he kept you out of it, you'd be safe from the fallout. But now... Claire's voice trailed off, and Maya could hear the pain in her mother's words. Now it's too late for that. Maya felt the weight of the truth crash over her like a wave. She had always trusted her father, believed in him, in his quiet strength and steady presence. But now, it felt like everything she knew was shattered. The truth that he had kept hidden from her, from Claire, was far darker than anything she had imagined. She shook her head, her hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the table. So what now? What do we do? Claire was silent for a moment. We fight. We expose the corruption. We bring the truth to light, no matter what the cost. We can't let this go on any longer, Maya. Maya stared at the phone, feeling the weight of her mother's words settle deep inside her. She couldn't let go of the image of her father, of the man who had tried to protect them, but in doing so, had made everything worse. He had kept this secret from them, and now they were all paying the price. Maya, Claire said, her voice softer now, I need you to be strong. We're going to get through this, but we can't do it without the truth. We have to take down the people who've been hiding behind their badges, the ones who've been covering up their lies for far too long. Maya nodded, a fire building in her chest. She wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything that had happened. The truth had been buried for too long, and she was going to make sure it was brought into the light. I'm ready, Maya said, her voice firm and resolute. Good, Claire replied, her voice steady. We fight together. We get the truth out, no matter what. As Maya hung up the phone, she sat there for a long moment, letting the weight of it all settle over her. The battle had just begun, and everything she had once believed was about to be tested. But she was ready. She had to be. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Maya sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind racing. This wasn't just another trial. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The case against Officer Clark was about to begin, and the weight of it all, everything that had happened, hung over them like a storm cloud. The media was there, cameras flashing as reporters scrambled to capture every moment. The city had never been more divided. On one side, there were those who believed in the cause, who saw this as an opportunity for change, a way to make things right. On the other side, there were the loyalists, the people who still stood by Clark, who were determined to protect their own. The courtroom was a battlefield, a place where the truth would either be upheld or buried. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the judge called the room to order. The moment had arrived. The tension in the room was palpable, every person in that room holding their breath, waiting for the first words to be spoken. Claire, her mother, sat beside her, her face stoic and unreadable. Maya could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the battle they had been fighting for so long finally taking its toll. This was it, the culmination of everything they had been working toward. The prosecutor stood first, walking to the front of the room with a sense of purpose. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady, we are here today because Officer Clark abused his power. He unjustly detained a young woman, Maya Thompson, based solely on the color of her skin. He harassed her, violated her rights, and created a situation that could have escalated into something far worse. The words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. She had heard them all before, but hearing them in the context of a courtroom, in front of everyone, made them feel real, like the truth was finally being recognized. The prosecutor continued, laying out the facts, detailing the evidence, Emily's video, witness testimony, the history of Officer Clark's actions, all building a case that seemed irrefutable. Maya's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair as she listened, trying to keep her emotions in check. Then it was Clark's turn. His defense attorney stood, a tall man in a sharp suit, his voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor," he began, "what we have here is a simple misunderstanding. Officer Clark was performing his duty. The area where Miss Thompson was walking was known for criminal activity, and his actions were based on reasonable suspicion. He did not detain her unlawfully. This was not about race. This was about protecting the community." The defense attorney's words echoed through the room, and Maya felt a cold chill spread through her. He was lying, twisting the facts, trying to manipulate the truth. She could see it in the way he spoke, the way he tried to frame the situation as something it wasn't. This wasn't about protecting the community. This was about control. This was about power. As the attorney spoke, Maya's mind drifted back to that day, to the moment when Officer Clark had approached her, when he had threatened her with his power, when he had tried to break her. She had been just a girl, walking home, and he had decided that was enough to make her a target. The prosecutor's voice cut through the noise. What Officer Clark failed to do was consider the humanity of Miss Thompson. He failed to see her as a person, a young woman going about her day. Instead, he saw her as a threat. And that is the heart of the problem we're dealing with today. Maya's chest tightened as the words sank in. She could feel the eyes of the room on her. The weight of the moment felt like it was crushing her, but she held her head high. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a bystander in this story. She was part of the change that needed to happen. The defense attorney countered with more talk about reasonable suspicion and the same tired arguments about public safety, but the damage had been done. The truth was out there. The witnesses had spoken. The video had been played. Officer Clark's actions could not be denied. Then came the pivotal moment. Maya stood, her legs shaking beneath her. Claire squeezed her hand, giving her a nod of encouragement. This was it. She was going to speak. She wasn't just going to be a witness anymore. She was going to tell her story, to make the world hear her truth. The room fell silent as she took the stand. The judge gave her a nod, his expression neutral. But there was something in his eyes that Maya couldn't quite read. She steadied her breath, the weight of the world settling on her shoulders. "Maya," the prosecutor said gently, "can you tell us about that day? What happened when Officer Clark stopped you?" Maya closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had rehearsed this moment in her head over and over, but now that it was real, the words felt like they were stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard and began. "I was just walking home," she said, her voice clear but trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't deserve to be treated the way I was. He didn't even ask me if I was okay. He didn't see me as a person. He saw me as a threat. And when I tried to tell him I hadn't done anything wrong, he didn't listen. He just kept pushing, kept trying to make me feel small." Her eyes flickered to the defense table, to Officer Clark. But she didn't look away. "I'm not just a name or a statistic. I'm a person. And that day, Officer Clark decided that because of the color of my skin, I didn't matter. And I'm here to tell you that I do matter. We all do." There was a long pause. Maya's heart raced, but the silence that followed felt almost comforting. She had spoken her truth, and there was no going back now. The room was still for a moment longer before the prosecutor stood, offering Maya a small, supportive smile. "Thank you, Maya." Maya returned the smile, though it felt shaky. She had done it. She had spoken out. She had said what needed to be said. The rest of the trial went on, but Maya felt a shift in the room. The energy had changed. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about something much bigger. This was a fight for dignity, a fight for respect, and Maya was no longer just a victim. She was part of the movement for change. When the judge called for a break, Maya sat back down beside her mother. Claire squeezed her hand, a proud, silent acknowledgement of everything Maya had just done. It wasn't over yet, but this was the moment the tide had begun to turn. Maya stood at the edge of the stage, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The courtroom had been tense all morning, but this moment was different. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. And she felt it. The pressure was too much. She had kept it together, had spoken her truth. But now, as the judge called for a brief recess, everything seemed to come crashing down. She stepped outside the courtroom, her legs shaky as she made her way to a quiet corner. The noise of the crowd, the murmurs of reporters and bystanders, all felt distant now. Maya had barely been able to process what had happened, her thoughts spinning in every direction. She needed a moment. Just one moment to breathe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden sound making her jump. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she unlocked the screen. It was a message from her father. "Maya, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." She stared at the message for a moment, her mind racing. Urgent. What could it be? Her father had been distant lately, dealing with his own guilt, trying to protect her, but Maya hadn't expected this. She quickly typed back, asking him to meet her outside. A few minutes later, her father appeared, stepping out from a side door. He looked just as he always did, composed, professional, but there was something in his eyes today, something that wasn't there before. Maya's stomach twisted with dread. Maya, we need to talk, he said, his voice low, urgent. What's going on? Maya asked, trying to steady herself, though she could feel the unease building in her chest. Her father motioned for her to follow him, and they stepped outside into the brisk air. The noise of the courthouse faded away as they walked further down the street, away from the crowd. I don't know how to tell you this, he began, his voice thick with emotion, but I've made a mistake. A huge one. Maya felt her chest tighten. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Her father stopped walking and turned to face her. I've been involved in something. Something I didn't think would come to this. There's a reason Officer Clark hasn't been fired yet. There's a reason this has dragged on for so long. It's because I've been covering for him. Maya's blood ran cold. She stared at him, trying to process his words. What? You've been covering for him? I didn't want to believe it, Maya, her father said, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe that someone I knew, someone I had worked with for so many years, was capable of the things he's done. But when I started digging into it, when I started seeing the truth, I realized I couldn't keep ignoring it. Maya's mind spun, her world tilting on its axis. This wasn't the father she had grown up with, the man who had always seemed so unshakable, so steady. He had hidden this from her, kept this truth buried, all while she had been fighting for justice. And now, everything felt like it was unraveling. Why didn't you tell me? Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper, the betrayal thick in her throat. Why didn't you tell me the truth? I thought I could fix it. I thought I could stop it without anyone knowing. I didn't want to hurt you, Maya. I didn't want you to be part of this, part of the mess that it's become, he said, his eyes filled with guilt. Maya's chest tightened. So what now? What do we do? Her father hesitated, his eyes flicking away. It's too late now. There's too much at stake. The department is going to protect Clark. They won't fire him. They'll make sure the investigation goes nowhere, and we'll all be left in the dust. No, Maya said sharply, her voice breaking through the fog of disbelief. We can't let it end like that. We can't let them cover this up. Not again. Her father shook his head, his expression one of deep regret. I don't know how to fix this, Maya. I don't know how to undo what I've done. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept my distance, kept quiet, everything would settle. But now it's all falling apart. Maya's mind raced. She had always believed in her father, in the idea that he could solve any problem, fix any situation. But now, with the truth laid bare, she realized that even the people closest to her had been part of the system that had failed them. Her father had been caught in the web, just like everyone else. But Maya wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. She had already made her choice when she stood up in that courtroom, when she told her story. There was no turning back. Dad, she said firmly, looking him in the eye, I'm not going to let this go. We're not going to let this go. We're going to take this all the way. We'll expose the truth, no matter what. Her father looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maya, No, she interrupted, her voice steady. This is about more than just us now. This is about everyone who's been hurt, everyone who's been silenced. This is about making sure people like Officer Clark can't hide anymore. And I won't stop until we get justice. The words hung in the air between them. Her father stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands shaking. For the first time, Maya saw him not as the protector, but as someone who had failed, who had allowed himself to become part of the problem. I'm sorry, he said quietly, the weight of his regret in every syllable. I should have done more. Maya took a deep breath. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. The resolve in her voice surprised both of them. Maya had always known she was capable of standing up for what was right, but now, with the truth laid bare, with everything hanging in the balance, she knew what needed to be done. This was the breaking point. This was where they either fought back or gave up. And Maya was done giving up. She turned away from her father, walking back toward the courthouse, ready to face whatever came next. The storm was far from over, but she was ready to face it head on. Maya sat on the steps of the courthouse, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the ground. It had been a long, grueling battle. The courtroom was silent, but in her mind, it was anything but. The trial, the betrayal, the secrets. It all felt like a blur now. The dust was beginning to settle, but the weight of it all still clung to her. She could feel the eyes of the city upon her, the world waiting for what came next. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her eyes flickered up to the sky, clear and blue, like it had always been. Was this what change felt like? She didn't know. She had always imagined that it would be a moment of triumph, a glorious victory. But this was different. There was no instant joy, no celebration. It was a quiet victory. And yet, there was a glimmer of something more, something she couldn't quite put into words, but it was there. It had always been there. The spark of hope that had refused to die no matter how many times it was buried under layers of pain and injustice. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Emily. "We did it, Maya. The news is everywhere. Clark's been fired. The department's under investigation. They can't hide anymore." A rush of relief surged through her. Maya didn't respond right away. She just sat there, feeling the magnitude of the moment, letting the truth settle in. They had won. Officer Clark had been fired. The department would be held accountable. But more than that, Maya had taken the first step in something much bigger than herself. She had exposed the truth. It wasn't over yet. The battle for justice was still far from finished. But this moment, the moment she had fought for, the moment she had bled for, had arrived. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Claire stood beside her, her presence steady and strong, but there was something else in her eyes. A warmth, a kind of peace that had been absent for weeks. The battle had taken its toll, but they were finally starting to see the light. "I'm proud of you, Maya," her mother said, her voice quiet, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. "You've done something incredible. You've made a difference." Maya looked up at her mother, her eyes still heavy with everything that had happened. "It doesn't feel like enough," she replied, her voice soft, unsure. Claire smiled, sitting beside her. "It's more than enough. You've shown the world that change is possible. And now, people will listen. You've given them something to believe in." Maya's gaze turned back to the courthouse steps, her mind racing. Had she really done it? Had she really been the spark that set this fire in motion? There were so many more battles to fight, so many more voices to lift. But for the first time, Maya felt like she wasn't fighting alone. She had her mother, she had Emily, and she had the community that had rallied behind her. Maya took a deep breath. She wasn't just standing here because of her mother's legacy or the fight of the past. She was here because she had chosen to step up, to speak out, and to fight for something bigger than herself. "I never thought it would come to this," Maya said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. "I never thought we could get this far." Her mother nodded, her eyes softening. "Neither did I, but we did it together. And now it's up to us to make sure the change doesn't stop here." Maya stood up, her legs still a little shaky from the long days of testimony and the emotional toll the trial had taken. She felt her mother's hand on her back, steadying her. They didn't need to say anything more. They knew what was next. The journey was far from over. But this was the beginning. As they walked away from the courthouse, Maya looked up at the sky again. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, she could see the possibility of change. The fight wasn't over, but the hope had returned. And that, she realized, was enough to keep moving forward.